The Sherman tank rumbled into the village of Oyen, its tracks biting into the hard red soil. Mud banks and cactus hedges lined the narrow street, and from the trees and the houses dug out beneath them, Japanese machine guns opened fire. The infantry were pinned down along the road, calling for the tanks to clear a path. This was the spearhead of the British 14th Army, 80 miles behind enemy lines, driving toward the vital supply hub of Meghtila. The date was the 22nd of February in 1945, and the battle for central Burma had just begun. From the leading Sherman, a squadron commander of Probyn's horse scanned the village through his open turret. Suddenly, a Japanese soldier burst from a hiding place and sprinted toward the tank. He clutched a wooden box against his chest, his face contorted with a desperate, anguished determination. Before anyone could react, he hurled himself under the tracks. There was a tremendous detonation. The tank shuddered and ground to a halt, its Sikh driver killed instantly. Colonel Miles Smeaton watched from his command tank and felt something he had not expected in battle. Not just horror, but a strange, unwilling admiration for the sheer, suicidal bravery of the enemy. The campaign that brought these tanks to this village had been conceived months earlier in the mind of General William Slim. He knew that to defeat the Japanese in Burma, he had to abandon the jungle slog and strike with mechanized speed at the enemy's lines of communication. Meghtila was that target. Its airfields would allow the 14th Army to keep advancing even as the monsoon approached. The race was on, but between the Irrawaddy River and Meghtila lay 80 miles of impossible terrain and an enemy who would fight with a fanaticism that British troops had never encountered before. How did an armored column reach the heart of Japanese central Burma? The answer began with a question Slim himself had asked, long before the tanks ever moved toward the river. It was September of 1944, and Slim was inspecting 255 Tank Brigade at Imphal. He was shown around the lines of Shermans, then turned to the brigade major, an officer named Alasdair Tuck. What was the most important quality of armor? Tuck gave the textbook answer: mobile striking power, the ability to save infantry lives. Slim stopped him. Those things were expected. The most important quality was reliability. Slim asked how reliable those Shermans were. Tuck replied that they were very reliable given enough fuel, essential spares, and some time at night for maintenance. Slim growled that Tuck had better be right, then stumped off to his jeep. The question was not academic. If the tanks broke down before reaching their objective, they would become a burden rather than a weapon. The Shermans had to move on their own tracks far longer than planned. The tank transporters that brought them down the valleys from Imphal were well past their best and kept breaking down until they finally gave up the ghost after 210 miles. Strangely, the tank transporter squadron was a theatrical touring company from England that had enlisted as a group. Actors, electricians, and stagehands ran the transporters, and they would occasionally bring two trailers together and put on a show for the troops. But their worn vehicles could not handle the brutal tracks. The Shermans ended up towing the transporters, covering a third of the journey on their own tracks. They tore up the one-way trail into deep, choking dust. In that dust, Smeaton's jeep driver skidded alongside his command tank, reached out a hand to fend off the vehicle, and was pulled into the tank suspension in a ghastly accident. As a Sherman of the Deccan Horse was being ferried across on a raft, a Japanese Oscar fighter swooped down out of the sun. The sappers manning the raft leaped overboard and clung to the sides. The raft circled slowly in the current, while the tank crew blazed away with the Browning anti-aircraft gun on the turret. Two Hurricanes roared in, pursuing the Oscar fighter. On the bank, Colonel Ralph Younger, the brigade's second-in-command, was having his morning shave. He jumped up and down with fury, but neither side scored a hit. 4 days later, 17 Indian Division broke out of the bridgehead. The objective was Meghtila, 80 miles distant, and the going was ferocious. The terrain was more desert than jungle now. The Shermans slid into dry ravine beds and clambered up the opposite banks, then forged through deep, powdery dust that clogged filters and choked engines. On the first day, the column made only 15 miles. Every village was a potential ambush. Every tree line concealed Japanese snipers. The war had changed from mountain jungle to open plains, and the tanks were learning the new rules as they advanced. That morning's fight at Oyen had been the column's first sharp action, and it had exposed a critical weakness in tank infantry coordination. The infantry wanted the Shermans to clear the village to make their advance simpler. The tanks, separated from their infantry, felt ungainly and dangerously exposed. Each Sherman carried a telephone mounted on its outside hull so infantrymen could talk directly to the crew inside. The theory of tank infantry communication was elegant. The practice under fire was almost impossible. With the lead tank now halted, smoke pouring from its suspension, the Rajputs remained pinned, and the squadron commander's crew scrambled to recover their dead Sikh driver. The suicide attack had stopped the advance in a single, devastating blow. The wooden box was the standard Japanese suicide charge. A single soldier would strap it to himself, wait for a tank to pass over his position, and pull the string. The tank's survival depended on alert crews and watchful infantry who could spot these attackers before they reached their target. Smeaton watched the faces of the Japanese as they ran. He later wrote, taken aback by their anguished look of determination and despair, pitting their puny strength against such tremendous force. This desperate form of courage was something the British knew little of. He watched with what he called amazement, admiration, and pity. When the fight for Oyen was over 200 Japanese lay dead among the foxholes and cactus hedges. The Rajputs had lost 70 men. Their company commander was dead. A tank commander had been shot through the head. That same day, far to the south, Allied aircraft flew over Meiktila and dropped warning leaflets. The slips of paper fluttered down over the lakes and red brick buildings of the beautiful old town. A Japanese civilian named Yoshiichi Shigemitsu, attached to the headquarters of Burma Area Army, picked one up. It announced that the Allied air forces would bomb Meiktila's supply installations on the 23rd of February. Non-combatants, and anyone who valued their lives, were urged to be at least 3 miles away. Shigemitsu was uneasy. He took the threat seriously and pressed his superiors to do the same. They told him not to concern himself. That night, staff cars began arriving in Meiktila from every direction. Lieutenant General Numata, the Chief of Staff of Southern Army, had flown in from Saigon. Lieutenant General Tanaka Shinichi, Kimura's Chief of Staff, presided. The agenda examined whether 15th Army could mount a counter-offensive on the west bank of the Irrawaddy. The generals discussed sweeping attacks across the river. They planned to pocket British forces in the Mu Valley, using divisions that were already shattered or scattered. It was a fantasy spun in complete ignorance of the facts on the ground. No one at the conference had any idea that British tanks were already 43 miles away, smashing through Taungtha. The reason for this catastrophic intelligence failure was stark. The Japanese battalion that fought Probin's horse at Oyen carried no wireless sets. The battle on the 22nd went entirely unreported. The fall of Taungtha was unknown to the High Command. When a report had been sent the day before warning of 2,000 vehicles approaching Meiktila, a 15th Army staff officer had dismissed it with contempt. "Do not be such a fool," he had said, and rung off. The skepticism was profound. The consequences would be devastating. 3 hours after the conference dispersed, an urgent signal reached Meiktila from a small unit south of Maingyan. The enemy had crossed the river and entered Taungtha. The force was estimated at 80 men in 8 vehicles, led by 2 tanks. Early the next morning, a second report arrived. The column was moving toward Mahlaing. 4 tanks, 20 trucks, perhaps 300 men. Shigemitsu realized with a jolt that if they hurried, they could be at the outskirts of Meiktila in 3 hours. The town had no combat troops, no proper defenses. An emergency meeting was called. A punitive force was cobbled together from hospital patients, transport clerks, and anti-aircraft gunners. The Japanese High Command had consistently underestimated the speed, audacity, and sheer momentum of the British mechanized thrust. Within 3 days, the Shermans would be on Meiktila's airfields. The battle for central Burma was about to reach its terrible, decisive climax. Major General Kasuya, the commander of No. 2 Field Transport, took charge of the improvised garrison. Meiktila had no prepared defenses, no heavy anti-tank guns, and no mines. Then the first contingent of 168th Regiment marched in behind their regimental flag. The men of Okami Division looked tough and showed no fatigue as they made for the Maleng Road. The garrison breathed easier, believing the crisis had been met just in time. 3 days later, Major General David Cowan stood over his maps and planned the assault. The geometry of the lakes dictated everything. The north and south lakes pinched the town like a hand gripping a balloon, leaving only narrow causeways for the tanks to enter. He decided on a wide armored loop north of the town, while 48th Brigade struck the Japanese installations beside the North Lake. 63rd Brigade would block the road to Chauk and attack from the west. The divisional artillery, massed a couple of miles behind 63rd Brigade, would cover the entire operation. General Slim flew in with Lieutenant General Frank Messervy in an American B-25, the RAF having refused to carry him into a still contested airfield. Thabutcon was peaceful when they landed, though occasional rifle fire crackled in the distance, and a Japanese corpse lay on the edge of the strip. Cowan's jeeps brought them north of the town, where two platoons of 1st Battalion the 7th Gurkhas were edging forward against what looked like innocent grassy hummocks. Through his binoculars, Slim could see the characteristic wisp of hot machine gun smoke rising from hidden loopholes. A single Sherman tank concealed itself in a hollow, creeping forward to fire a couple of rounds, then ducking back out of sight. Messervy and an American general crawled behind a clump of cactus to get a better view. The Sherman worked around a spinney and opened fire again. The overshoots came straight toward the observation party. Slim threw himself flat. The American aircrewman beside him hurled himself straight into a cactus hedge and emerged like a blood-stained pincushion. The Gurkhas dashed forward, thrusting Tommy guns through the loopholes and spraying the bunker interiors. Half a dozen Japanese sprinted from cover and were brought down by automatics. A tall Japanese survivor was finished off by a tank round, a sight Slim found utterly unnecessary, an emphatic punctuation mark he later described with distaste. By the 2nd of March, the Deccan Horse were ready to push into the eastern quarter of the town, but the open ground ahead of them was covered in pockmarks, regular lines of freshly dug pits. Colonel Alan Wakefield, an intelligence officer attached to his old regiment, noticed them at once. He was not commanding a tank formation, but he recognized the danger. He signaled the tanks to halt and cover him, then dismounted and walked forward alone, pistol in hand. In each pit crouched a Japanese soldier clutching a fused 250-kilogram aerial bomb between his knees, a brick in his hand, waiting to smack the fuse when a tank passed overhead. Wakefield moved from pit to pit, shooting each man cleanly in the head before he could detonate. The Japanese had been ordered to trigger their bombs only for tanks, not for a lone officer on foot. None of them struck the fuse. When Wakefield paused to reload, he remained miraculously unscathed by fire from the railway station. He cleared the entire human minefield without a single explosion. The ground was safe. The Deccan Horse rumbled forward and smashed into the railway station, while on the other side of the town, 48th and 63rd Brigades fought house to house through burning buildings. The defenders fired petrol dumps into walls of flame and used anti-aircraft machine guns with armor-piercing shot that stuck in the tank armor like pincushions. On the morning of the 3rd, organized resistance collapsed. Major General Kasuya, his garrison shattered, ordered the 30 or 40 survivors to break out toward Thazi. He had lost contact with higher command days earlier. 2 of his regimental commanders lay dead, and his mountain artillery battalion had been destroyed gun by gun. The remnants of 168th Regiment and the Scratch garrison slipped through gaps in the cordon under darkness. British sappers and infantry began counting the dead. Over 2,000 Japanese bodies were tallied in the town area. 47 prisoners were taken, a remarkably high figure for the Burma campaign. 48 guns were captured. In the aftermath, the brigade major noted that even the sick in hospital had sharpened bamboo poles into bayonets. Bodies continued to surface in the lake for weeks. A few Japanese dug themselves out of collapsed bunkers 10 days later, too weak from thirst to do damage, but still prepared to have a go before being shot. The capture of Mike Tiller in 4 days was, as Slim later wrote, a magnificent feat of arms. Brigadier Claude Pert, the commander of 255th Tank Brigade, received an immediate Distinguished Service Order for outstanding cavalry leadership. The division had secured the airfields that would sustain its southward pursuit. With Meiktila in British hands, the Japanese High Command finally grasped the scale of the disaster. The staff officers who had dismissed earlier reports of 2,000 vehicles now faced the collapse of their entire strategic position in central Burma. The battering ram had smashed clean through their rear areas, and Rangoon lay open beyond. The siege of Meiktila began on the 4th of March, as the remnants of broken Japanese divisions converged from every direction. From the north came Sakuma Force, the battered 214th Regiment that had been fighting since the bridgehead at Nyaungu. From the south, the survivors of 49th Division crawled toward the town they had failed to defend. From the east, elements of 18th Division filtered down from the Shan Plateau, their commander Lieutenant General Masaki Honda now tasked with retaking what had been lost in 4 catastrophic days. Cowan did not wait for them to tighten the ring. He ordered 5 armored columns to sweep outward along the radiating roads, smashing into the assembling Japanese before they could dig in. The mobile columns hit hard at Malayang, at Zayatkhon, at Wundwin. Armored cars and tanks of Probin's horse rolled out each morning with infantry clinging to the hulls, hunting pockets of resistance in the scrubby country west of the town. A second series of sweeps between the 8th and 12th of March struck strong opposition near Yindor, 10 miles south, where Naganuma Force had emplaced 49 guns near the Mindorgian Lake. The roadblocks halted 48th Brigade cold, and the Japanese artillery began to find its range on the defensive box. The siege was becoming a gunner's battle. Inside the perimeter, the shelling was constant and accurate. The Japanese gunners had observation posts in trees and on the high ground east of the town. Jack Scollin, an artillery observer with B Flight of 656 Squadron RAF, lived in a slit trench and flew every morning in a light plane from a strip beside the lake. His job was to find the guns that were pulverizing the British positions. He described the frustration of searching for over an hour above the suspected areas, circling and watching, while reports crackled over the radio that another round had landed somewhere in the box. More than once he felt the physical thump of a gun's blast through the floor of his aircraft, as it fired somewhere beneath him, invisible in the scrub. The worst offender was a single field gun that fired irregular rounds into the town, never from the same position twice. It had been harassing the defenders for days. Scollin had almost given up on the afternoon of the 25th when, turning south to leave the search area, he glanced back through the perspex roof of his cockpit. A red muzzle flash winked at him from a clump of bushes. He shouted over the radio that he had the target, ordered the medium guns back into action, and swung his plane around to begin fire direction. He put down 2,100-pound shells around the target. 2 of them fell directly into the clump of bushes where the gun was hidden. The gun did not fire into Mike Tiller again. Scollin felt the quiet pride of a former flash spotter who had done his job. But the siege wore on. The Japanese brought up more guns, replacing the ones Cowan's columns destroyed. Colonel Uga of the 49th Artillery Regiment manhandled his mountain pieces to within yards of the British perimeter, firing over open sights like a samurai, with a white headband tied round his helmet. The shell that killed Brigadier Bailey's Batman at the brigade command post was not an isolated tragedy. It was the rhythm of existence in the box. On the 22nd of March, Major General David Cowan received the news that his son had died of wounds at Mandalay. The young man had joined their old battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 6th Gurkhas, and General Slim had spoken to him only days before. Cowan absorbed the blow in silence and continued to direct the defence of Meiktila without outward sign of collapse. But his subordinates knew. The division commander was fighting his hardest battle while carrying a grief no order of the day could acknowledge. That same night, Colonel Uga unleashed his most determined attack. He had captured a British Sherman tank days earlier, its turret jammed, but its guns still operational. Uga had it repaired by his engineers and hidden with meticulous care. He positioned 2 75mm guns forward as well, and assembled 500 men from 106th Regiment of 49th Division. At dusk they moved toward the southeast corner of 48th Brigade's perimeter, where the 1st Battalion of the 7th Gurkhas and the 4th Frontier Force Regiment held wide-in positions. The captured Sherman rumbled ahead of the infantry, its engine roaring, its cannon blazing into the darkness. The attack punched a hole in the box. Flares arced up over the perimeter, illuminating a nightmare of screaming men and muzzle flashes. The Sherman, unable to fire in any direction except forward, careened through the defensive line, firing blindly. Uga's mountain guns fired point-blank into the trenches. The Japanese infantry swarmed through the gap, and for a time it seemed the position might break, but the wide defences held. Machine gun fire from the Gurkhas and the Frontier Force men cut the attackers down in heaps. The captured Sherman, its driver apparently unable to find second gear, lurched toward a deep ditch, overturned and exploded. By dawn, the attack had collapsed. Colonel Yuga, who had fought his guns forward like a man possessed, was hit by a shell fragment. His men carried him to the rear, but he died of his wounds. The Japanese later wrote that he had fought like a god. His attack left 195 dead on the wire and in the trenches, and the southeast corner of the box still held. The British counted their own casualties and buried their dead. The siege of Meiktila had not broken. Cowan emerged from the battle with his division intact and his personal grief locked away. The Japanese 33rd Army, now under Honda's command, had thrown everything available into the counterattack and failed. The remnants of 18th and 49th Divisions began to pull back toward Pyabwe, where Honda intended to make a final stand on the road to Rangoon. What remained of the Japanese Central Front was dissolving. The battering ram had not only shattered the gate, it had smashed clear through the wall behind it. On the 30th of March, 17th Indian Division began to move south out of Meiktila. The armoured fist that had shattered the Japanese garrison was now a pursuit force, and its commander was in a hurry. Rangoon lay 338 miles away, and the monsoon was coming. The plan was audacious, a classic pincer movement on the town of Pyobwe, 26 miles down the road, where Lieutenant General Masaki Honda intended to make a stand with what remained of his shattered 33rd Army. The right claw of the pincer was a powerful independent column under Brigadier Claude Pert. They called it Claude Col. It consisted of 2 squadrons of Probian's Horse, 2 armoured car squadrons of 16th Light Cavalry, a battery of self-propelled guns, engineers and motorized infantry, the 4th Bombay Grenadiers, and the 6th, 7th Rajputs. Pert's orders were to cut a wide arc west of Pyobwe, crush any opposition in the villages, and sever the main road south of the town. On the 4th of April, Claude Col hit the village of Yindor. A high earthen bund surrounded it, backed by a ditch, both effective anti-tank obstacles. A lake covered one flank. About 1,000 men from the Japanese 49th Division held the village, well dug in with anti-tank guns. The Rajputs attacked the northern edge of the bund and were driven back by withering fire. 2 company commanders fell. The tanks could not find a way in to help. Pert made a hard decision. He would not allow his fast armoured column to be bogged down in a set-piece village battle. He called off the assault, signalled for the mopping up to be left to 5th Division, coming up behind, and bypassed Yindor entirely. The column swung south and east. 2 days later, on the 6th of April, it slammed into the village of Yanaung and caught something unexpected, the ragged remnants of the Japanese 53rd Division. Takeda's division was a ghost of its former self. After weeks of retreat from Taungtha, it had exactly 2 anti-tank guns, 2 battalion guns, no field artillery, and exhausted men who had not slept properly in days. Claude Col's Shermans tore into them with airburst, high-explosive and machine guns. 230 Japanese soldiers died in that encounter. Their anti-tank guns were crushed under the tracks. The survivors scattered into the scrub. Pert did not pause. He pushed on to Wiwadan, surprising the defenders there and killing over 200 more. Then he sent a detachment south to Yamathin and began curling eastward toward the main road. He was now south of Pyobwe, moving up from behind. What Pert did not know, what no one in British intelligence had realized, was that Honda had sighted his army headquarters in a small, unnamed village 1,000 yards south of the town. The afternoon sun beat down on Honda's encampment. A scattering of bamboo huts, a few groves of conifers, a vineyard on one side, and the terraced sunken terrain that made this a poor place for tanks to maneuver. Honda was taking a meal with his staff officers. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, the aggressive veteran of the Malaya campaign, and now a key staff officer of 33rd Army, was with him. Suddenly, from the southwest, came the sound of heavy gunfire, growing louder by the second. Tsuji grabbed his binoculars and turned toward the noise. 10 tanks were approaching in a cloud of dust, British M4 Shermans. They had sliced through 53rd Division and were now cutting straight across the vineyard, directly toward the headquarters encampment. Shells began to fall around the huts. Machine gun bullets raked the transport park. Flames shot up from the trucks. 300 men, mostly intendants' clerks, medical officers, and administrative personnel, scattered in all directions. Tsuji saw panic spreading and seized on an absurd remedy. In the center of the encampment stood the well they used for drinking water and washing. He stripped off his uniform, raised the bucket high, and poured cold water over his head. Then he began to rub himself down with a towel, as casually as if he were at a bathhouse in Tokyo. The intendant's chief rushed up, pale-faced and armed to the teeth, demanding to know what was happening. Tsuji looked at him calmly. "I'm having a cold shower," he said. "Won't you join me?" The men stared. Then, in spite of themselves, they smiled. The panic broke. Not far away, Honda crouched in a foxhole, writing his will. He did not expect to survive, but the strange spectacle of his staff officer bathing naked under fire had done its work. Headquarters regained its composure. The British shell fire poured into the vineyard and the huts until nightfall. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Pert's tanks broke off the engagement and made for Pyobwe. They had no idea what they had just let slip through their fingers. The failure to capture Honda was the result of a simple communications breakdown. 33rd Army's wireless sets had ceased to function days earlier. No signals were broadcast, none intercepted, and the British listening service at Moniwa that regularly broke Japanese codes had picked up nothing. Pert's column was operating blind to the prize in its path. It was not the last time Honda would escape by the narrowest of margins. Burmese longyi, a sarong-like garment, tucked the written order into his waist and placed a hand grenade inside his shirt. He walked calmly through the British tank positions, past Indian sentries, into Pyobwe itself. When patrols stopped him, he threw the grenade, killed the men surrounding him, and sprinted to 18th Division headquarters. He returned the same way, munching a banana. The orders were delivered. The escape was prepared. The battle for Pyobwe ended on the 11th of April. Honda's 33rd Army was shattered. Fewer than 8,000 men remained from what had been 4 divisions. The British had 2 corps racing south, one down the Irrawaddy Valley, one down the main road. The race for Rangoon was on. Slim had 312 miles to cover, and 3 weeks before the amphibious assault, codenamed Dracula, was scheduled to strike the city from the sea. But the speed of the pursuit was not merely a matter of roads and petrol. At a meeting in Moniwa in late March, the High Command had debated postponing Dracula entirely. The overland columns were moving so fast, the thinking went, that a seaborne landing would be unnecessary. That optimism vanished when intelligence reports showed the Japanese were digging in for a fight. The Calcutta decision was reversed. Dracula would go ahead, with a target date in the first week of May. By the 19th of April, 5th Indian Division had taken over the lead from 17th. Honda was retreating south, and his army was now truly a skeleton. The terrain ahead was cut by countless chongs, the seasonal streams and dry watercourses that laced the central plain. 18th Division mustered 3,100 men with 4 mountain guns. 49th Division had 1,600 men with a single mountain gun. 53rd Division had 1,600 men and no guns at all. The total force Honda commanded was smaller than a full-strength British brigade, and yet Kimura, from his headquarters in Rangoon, continued to issue orders to stop the enemy before Tongu. At Pyonmana, 150 miles from Rangoon, the Japanese sapper charged with blowing the Sinthachong Bridge north of the town fell asleep. He was still asleep when Colonel Blackacre's tanks of the Gordon Highlanders, 116th Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps, rumbled across the intact bridge and into Pyonmana before dawn. The sapper woke up in a daze, saw what had happened, and fled into the jungle. The bridge was not the only thing the Japanese lost that day. Honda had positioned his headquarters a mile south of Pyonmana in a tiny cluster of huts beside a small wood. Near the road, the abandoned staff car of Lieutenant General Hanaya, the old bully from Arakan, sat in plain view. The British tank crews spotted the car and followed the side road that led toward it. That road led them directly to Honda. By mid-morning, about 20 Shermans were pouring fire into the headquarters compound. The little temples caught fire, the conifers blazed. Honda, his chief of staff Soromoto, and Tsuji shared a foxhole as the shells crashed around them. They had faced this before, and by now they had developed a routine for escape. Honda signed the army's orders. 3 young subalterns, including the indomitable Fujimoto, volunteered to carry the orders through the British cordon. Tsuji hacked open a rotten melon with his knife and distributed it among them, the first moisture they had tasted since morning. Then they slipped away into the darkness. At midnight, the headquarters group went into action. They crawled on their bellies past the British tank sentries, who were laughing and drinking in the warm darkness, apparently celebrating in whiskey the triumph they assumed would come at dawn. Tsuji inched forward, sword in hand, listening to the voices. One by one, the staff officers, the wounded on stretchers, the clerks and orderlies, all 40 survivors of the day's shelling, passed through the perimeter and formed up in the darkness of the paddy fields beyond. When they reached the railway line, they knew they were safe. Tanks could not negotiate the embankment, and the iron rails were an unmissable guide south. Tsuji, elated at their escape, left a note for the enemy. He took out his signal pad and wrote, "Go Kuro-sama, sorry to cause you so much trouble. This spot is where Lieutenant General Honda was. Try harder next time, sayonara." He placed it where the morning patrols would find it. By dawn, the British artillery was pounding the empty village they had abandoned. Now the rains came. On the 29th of April, 2 weeks ahead of the normal monsoon, a wall of water descended on Lower Burma. The torrential downpour turned the paddy fields between Pegu and the Sitang into shallow lakes. At Tonggu, the forward airfields became unusable and 221 Group was forced to withdraw every close support squadron except one. The armour was confined to the metalled road. 17th Division went on half rations. The race was slipping away. Major General David Cowan drove his men forward through the deluge. On the 29th of April, his armour reached the edge of Pegu, just 50 miles from Rangoon. The town was defended by a scratch force under Major General Matsui, Marines, anti-aircraft gunners, railway staff, even Japanese civilians recently conscripted and put into uniform. They used airstrike bombs buried in the road, a captured Sherman tank, and fanatical suicide charges to delay the British advance. The bridges were blown, every yard was contested. But the battle for Pegu lasted only 2 days. On the 30th of April, Matsui received an order from Kimura in Rangoon: return with all speed and defend the capital to the death. Matsui understood what that meant. It was a death sentence for his men, a futile gesture. He withdrew his forces from Pegu, marching them not toward Rangoon, but toward the Sitang. Before leaving, he gave the order to release the prisoners of war in Rangoon Gel. Over 1,000 men, too sick to walk, were told they were free. A message was pinned to the main gate. Even before the formal link-up, the race had been decided by a lone pilot. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May, Wing Commander Saunders, seeing the city empty of Japanese, landed his Mosquito on the cratered Mingaladon airfield. He made his way to Rangoon Gaol, where the freed prisoners confirmed the Japanese had gone. With extraordinary panache, he walked to the docks, commandeered a sampan, and sailed down the Rangoon River to meet the incoming landing craft of 26th Division. 4 days later, at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 6th of May, the lead company of the 1st 7th Gurkhas, the battalion that had been with 17th Division since 1942, met a column of Lincolns from 26th Division at Heligu. They were 27 miles north of Rangoon. The overland thrust and the seaborne landing had joined hands. The race was over, but deeper in the jungle, another army was still intact, still armed, and still waiting. The Pegu Yomas swallowed the 28th Army in the second week of May. These were not the towering ranges of North Burma, but a dense, low-lying tangle of bamboo and teak running 80 miles north to south. The monsoon, already 2 weeks old, turned every track into a mudslide. Streams became torrents overnight. Sakurai's men, what remained of them, trudged deeper into the hills, away from the roads, away from the British armour that could not follow them here. Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai was the man who had captured Rangoon 3 years before. Now he was retreating into the jungle with the last intact Japanese army in Burma. His staff, Tsuchiya, Yamaguchi, Fukutomi, Okudaira, were old military academy comrades. They shared a bamboo hut with a scooped-out fireplace and a map table. The army had brought rice, salt, and ammunition. But Sakurai knew, from the first week, that time was the real enemy. The monsoon would not break until October, and the British were already sealing the exits. Colonel Saito Hiro of Shinbu Force understood morale as well as logistics. A man born in Paris and raised in a French mission school, he had a sharp, almost literary sensibility uncommon among Japanese staff officers. In the trackless forest, he began giving the assembly points names: Asahi, rising sun; Akatsuki, dawn; Tsukimi, moon viewing. Then deeper names: Misogi, the ritual of purification, where men wrote their wills. Kachidoki, the battle cry, where the force would finally concentrate. The names were small things, but they reminded starving, sodden soldiers that they were still men with a purpose and a homeland. The army's survival depended on crossing rivers. Lieutenant Kitamura was the answer to that problem. 9 years earlier, at the Los Angeles Olympics, he had won gold in the 1500 meters freestyle. Now he slipped through Burmese guerrilla camps and British patrols, sliding into chongs under the reeds to measure current strength and depth. He trained the men in small groups, teaching them to strip off their packs and use bamboo poles for buoyancy. The soldiers called him Oja, the champ, and they trusted his judgment absolutely. Food was the grinding, daily crisis. The army had a month's rice when it entered the hills. Foraging parties crept down toward the western foothills, but the villages were hostile now. The Burma National Army had changed sides and was collaborating with the British. Small Japanese parties were ambushed and killed. The army turned to bamboo shoots. It was the best season for them, and to wild grasses, snakes, lizards, and the occasional pheasant. Salt came from a sour sauce made of fermented mangoes. Major Yamaguchi, the staff officer in charge of supply, calculated that the men could survive on this diet for perhaps 2 months. After that, the mathematics became unforgiving. On the 2nd of July, a patrol of the 1st 7th Gurkhas was working the eastern foothills near the village of Myeongyeong. They belonged to 48th Brigade of the old 17th Division, the same battalion that had linked up with 26th Division at Tlegu. The Gurkhas bumped a small Japanese force in the dense scrub. A brief, vicious firefight followed. When the shooting stopped, 19 Japanese lay dead. The Gurkhas searched the bodies. Among the usual photographs, paybooks, and name seals, they found a leather dispatch bag, soaked through by the monsoon. The bag reached the village of Penwegon, the headquarters of the newly reconstituted 17th Indian Division. It was placed on a table in a rain-lashed hut. Lieutenant Levy, a young officer from the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, began to tease the sodden papers apart. He had only recently arrived from Pegu, and he expected nothing more than the usual unit identifications and diary scribbles. Then he unfolded a set of tissue paper maps, penciled over British Army sheets. Beside him, his predecessor Stanley Charles glanced down and drew a sharp breath. Levy began typing out the translation. The document was an operation order, dated the 14th of June, bearing the signature of Major General Nagasawa Kenichi. It was the complete extraction plan for Shimbu Force, the infantry group of the 55th Division. Levy read the routes, the crossing points, the passwords. Charles hissed, "Christ, this is red hot," and bolted out to find the divisional staff. Within minutes, the intelligence was being copied and rushed to higher command. The British had been handed Sakurai's entire plan on a plate. The order detailed 3 columns, each with precisely defined paths, contour heights, and chong crossing points. The passwords were Kami and its countersign Kaze, an unoriginal but functional choice. There were instructions about rations, about the collection of country boats on the Sitang, about bullocks and horses and spare shoes. Cold steel would be the order of the day, no firing during the initial breakout, to prevent confusion among the marching columns. The operation was scheduled for the 20th of July. Sakurai had fixed his X-day, and now the British knew it. The translation was completed at the headquarters of IV Corps in Pegu 3 days later. A final verified version reached Mountbatten's rear headquarters in Delhi by the 16th of July. The new commander of 17th Division, Major General Crowther, issued his own operation instruction based on the captured intelligence. He rejected the previous strategy of trailing small parties to the Sitang. The Japanese were coming in a single, concentrated wave. Crowther's plan was simpler: destroy them as they crossed the Mandalay-Rangoon road, or as they came within range of the guns. The British artillery began to register on every known crossing point along the 74 miles of road held by 17th Division. The document had shown exactly where Sakurai intended to pass: routes, assembly areas, riverbank objectives. Gunners noted the map references. They calculated ranges, adjusted elevations, and locked their pieces onto fixed lines. Ammunition dumps were positioned forward. Medium guns, field guns, and howitzers were laid on the killing ground. There was no need for elaborate deployment. The Japanese were coming to them. The monsoon rain fell in sheets. day after day. The gun positions turned into islands of mud, but the crews kept their weapons serviceable. East of the road, the paddy fields became shallow lakes. Elephant grass grew higher than a man's head. The railway embankment was the only dry path across the flooded terrain. British patrols found movement almost impossible in the chest-deep water. But the guns did not need to move. They simply waited, loaded, and aimed at coordinates that had been marked on maps weeks before. 17th Division deployed ambushes based on the captured intelligence. Strongpoints were established at the villages of Penwagon and Canyutquin. Infantry companies dug in along the likely crossing routes. The division's tanks were held in reserve, ready to race to any breach. The plan was brutally simple: allow the leading Japanese elements to cross the road, then close the gap behind them with artillery. The column would be cut in two. The forward half would be pursued to the Sitang and destroyed on the riverbank. Deep in the Yomas, Sakurai's men had no idea that their plan had been betrayed. Colonel Okamura, the engineer, was testing bamboo rafts in the streams, 24 poles, each 16 feet long, lashed with bark stripped from broadleaf trees. He called it the rope of life. Kitamura continued his reconnaissance swims, timing the current and marking fordable points. Colonel Saito watched his men grow gaunt and hollow-eyed on their diet of bamboo shoots and mango sauce. The code names, Dawn, Moon Viewing, Battle Cry, still hung on the bamboo shacks. But the men who lived under them were beginning to die of cholera and plague. On the 20th of July, Sakurai gave the order to move. The columns assembled in the darkness, loaded their bamboo rafts, and began the final march toward the Mandalay-Rangoon road. They did not know that every gun in Ivy Corps had been registered on the paths they were about to walk, the ammunition dumps positioned forward. The pieces loaded and aimed at map references nailed down weeks before. The trap was complete. The killing ground was prepared, and the gunners were watching their watches, counting down the minutes until the first Japanese soldier stepped out of the tree line. The artillery opened up at 3 in the morning. Shells from medium guns, field guns, and howitzers tore into the marching columns as they reached the open ground of the road corridor. Green signal flares curved into the night sky. Heavy machine guns opened from both sides. The Japanese soldiers, ordered to use only cold steel for the initial penetration, had no way to reply. Men went down in rows. The columns fragmented, some pressing forward through the gunfire, others scattering into the flooded paddy fields where the water was already chest-deep. The British plan worked with mechanical precision. Leading elements were allowed to cross the road, and then the artillery closed the gap behind them, cutting each column in two. Those who reached the Sitang found a river transformed by the monsoon. The dry season width of 80 to 150 yards had swollen to over 300 yards of fast, brown water. Men launched their bamboo rafts into the current, 24 poles lashed together with bark rope. The rafts capsized almost instantly, spilling soldiers into the torrent. They screamed the names of their units into the darkness, shouts that were swallowed by the roar of the water. Horses were swept away, staff officers collapsed from the strain of marshalling the shattered columns. Dysentery, malaria, and starvation had already reduced the army to wraiths. The river finished what the guns had started. By mid-August, the scale of the catastrophe was clear. 54th Division, which had entered the Yomas with over 9,000 men, could muster fewer than 4,000 survivors. Shinbu force of the 55th Division was largely destroyed. Over 5,000 men from that division alone lay dead in the waterlogged approaches to the Sitang, or had been swept away by the current. The gunners of IV Corps had fought what one British officer later called the most successful battle of the Burma campaign. They had done it largely without infantry contact. The guns and the river had done the killing for them. The last formation to break out was the strangest. 13 Naval Guard force, 1,200 sailors and shore personnel of the Imperial Japanese Navy, chose to make their attempt alone on the night of the 31st of July. They moved south from the Yomas later than the army columns, hoping to slip through a gap the earlier breakouts might have created. Their commander was Captain Fukami, a veteran of Arakan. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Shinzo Tsutsumi, checked each man's load as they assembled in the darkness: bamboo poles, a few grenades, and the last of the unit's rice. The sailors were gunners, mechanics, boatswains, and signalmen, not infantrymen, but they carried rifles, grenade launchers, and a few light machine guns. They crossed the Mandalay Road at 3 in the morning, without a shot meeting them. For a brief moment, Tsutsumi believed they had slipped through unseen. Then the night sky tore open with green and yellow signal flares. Heavy machine guns opened up from both sides of the road corridor. Mortar bombs began to drop among the sailors. The British had not left a gap. They had simply waited for the naval unit to walk into the killing ground. 400 men died in that ambush. Captain Fukami took grenade fragments in the stomach as he tried to rally his men. The survivors, now numbering fewer than 150, carried Fukami on a stretcher through 6-foot elephant grass toward the Sitang. On the 8th of August, a final skirmish with Gurkhas reduced the unit to 17 men. Fukami died that day, his stomach wound too severe for any field dressing. Tsutsumi and his remaining sailors reached the riverbank, built a bamboo raft from poles, stripped from a nearby village, and pushed off at 11 at night. The current seized the raft in midstream and bore it relentlessly downstream. By dawn, Tsutsumi's foot scraped the riverbed of the east bank, and he and 4 others crawled onto the mud, the rest of the 17 having vanished into the water. They marched for days through jungle and rubber plantations, eating nothing but what they could scavenge. Tsutsumi guided them with a pocket compass, his maps long since reduced to pulp by the monsoon. They crossed a vast false lake created by the overflowing Sitang, swimming for 5 days with banana stalks for buoyancy, sleeping strapped to the branches of submerged trees. Ants crawled over their faces as they slept, water leeches clung to their legs. They came across the corpses of drowned soldiers, hundreds of them, turning slowly in the river weeds. On the 9th of September, they heard a voice calling in Japanese through the trees. The voice belonged to Major Wako, a peace envoy from Burma Area Army. He carried a white flag and a rising sun banner, and he was flanked by an unarmed companion. Tsutsumi told his men to fix bayonets and gripped his pistol as Wako came to a halt 10 paces away. Wako handed over a document on thick paper. Tsutsumi ran his eyes over the imperial rescript, announcing that the war was over. Wako read it aloud, his voice steady but strained. The sailors listened in silence. One of them stepped forward and said he would kill himself. Wako's voice sharpened. Suicide was forbidden, he said. The emperor had commanded them to endure the unendurable. Tsutsumi was the last to accept it, telling Wako he was Navy and needed to report to his own headquarters at Moulmein. Wako reluctantly agreed, but 2 days later they met again, and this time the major would not budge. Tsutsumi climbed a small hill and looked down at the surrender camp on the outskirts of Shwegyin, where several hundred Japanese soldiers were assembled in a clearing. He walked to a lake at the bottom of the hill and hurled his grandfather's sword into the water. A British lieutenant in a Burmese longyi rode out to meet them, saluted Tsutsumi, and greeted him in broken Japanese. As they crossed the Shwegyin Shaong in the late afternoon sunlight, the lieutenant began to whistle the pastoral symphony, and Tsutsumi, still dark with anger, found himself whistling it too. General Slim took leave in Britain and never returned to the theatre, later becoming Chief of the Imperial General Staff and Governor-General of Australia, while Major General Cowan departed his division in June. His war finished. Lieutenant General Sakurai reached Moulmein on the 18th of August, where General Kimura put an arm around his shoulders and said, "It has been a long time. I am sorry." Lieutenant General Honda surrendered his shattered forces in Tenasserim. Lieutenant Commander Tsutsumi survived and wrote the story of his odyssey. Brigadier Claude Pert retired with his DSO and later bred polo ponies in England. Colonel Miles Smeaton recovered from his facial wound and became a celebrated round-the-world sailor and author. Jack Scollan returned to civilian life and never forgot the muffled gun thump he felt through the floor of his Auster. Yoshiichi Shigemitsu survived the war and returned to Japan, haunted by the officers who had dismissed his warning. The Burma campaign, which had begun with the Japanese sweeping through in weeks, ended with their last intact army drowning in a monsoon-swollen river. The longest campaign of the war against Japan closed not with a bang, but with a young British lieutenant whistling Beethoven across dark water and a starving Japanese sailor whistling it back. If you have a personal story, a family memory, or a historical anecdote from the Burma campaign or the war in the Far East, we invite you to share it in the comments below. We read every one. And if you would like to support more historical documentaries like this one, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening.